Hey there, my name is Bernadette Smith. My pronouns are she and her. Welcome to 5 Things in 15 Minutes, my weekly show where I bring good vibes to DEI. That is good vibes to diversity, equity, and inclusion with a little dash of corporate social responsibility. What I've found is that there are lots of news stories about what's going wrong in the world and lots of negative data. But there are also a lot of things going right. That's what I like to focus on. I search for DEI stories that we can be inspired by and learn from. My hope is to inspire you to experiment with some of these inclusive actions and policies within your own organization to help you build a more inclusive world. In this week's episode, I'm joined by Joel Davis Brown, speaker and author of The Souls of Queer Folks. This week, our conversation is about a Korean company using Korean names, American Sign Language on PBS shows, and more. Let's get started. Joel, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to see you again. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. Will you tell folks a little bit about yourself?
Oh boy. Okay. So I'm an author. I wrote a book called The Souls of Queer Folk: How Understanding the LGBTQ plus culture can transform your leadership practice, which is based on the notion that a lot of the skills that we are looking to acquire or see expressed in our leaders already exist within marginalized communities. And so the
Mhm.
LGBTQ plus community, for example, has a long and storied history of being adaptive, resilient, authentic, creative, innovative, and employing non-binary thinking, just to name a few. And so the opportunity is for us to learn from those within our midst who have to acquire and learn these skills just to survive, if we want to learn how we can help our organizations and our communities and our planet thrive as well. So that was the book. I'm a public speaker. I also own an organizational strategy consultancy, and we've been doing that work for almost 20 years. I can't believe I just said that. And then when I still have a little bit of time left, I'm a professor in leadership development and storytelling in Paris, France.
Wow. I love it. Paris, France. How did you get that gig?
It's all about relationships. So one of
Yeah.
the things I say to my students all the time is relationships are the currency of success. And so I have a good friend who found out I was finishing my doctorate work, said, "Are you interested in teaching anything or in teaching, period?" I said, "Sure." I said, "As long as it's not something boring." He said, "Well, come up with a proposal." I came up with a proposal, not really thinking it was going to be accepted. And voila, it was. And I've been teaching there now for 7 years.
I love it. I absolutely love it. Before we went live, we talked a little bit about manifestation, and it sounds like you manifested that. All right. So, in this week's 5 Things newsletter, I wrote a little bit about unique wisdom, and this sort of goes along with your book. Last week was Lesbian Visibility Week, and I posted on LinkedIn about Lesbian Visibility Day, and a little bit of self reflection on my own journey. And what I know about myself is because of my sexuality, I have a whole lot of resilience and I have a whole lot of empathy, which I think goes along with what you're talking about in your book, right? Those unique gifts, that unique wisdom. But what I was reflecting on is sort of beyond that. We all have our unique wisdom, every single one of us, because of our own stories and our own experiences. And how do we actually slow down enough to see that in others when the world moves so fast and when some people really annoy us?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think part of what I'm trying to do, frankly, is to decolonize how we look at leadership.
Mm,
Leadership is something that's typically thought of as only occurring in corporate boardrooms, in military spaces. It only belongs to those who have a certain profile. And I want to deconstruct, and I've been working to deconstruct that. So, for example, you don't have to go to Harvard Business School. No offense to Harvard Business School, but you don't have to go to business school. You don't have to be a military general. You don't have to be some titan of industry in order to affect person or great leadership. All of us do. And so I think back to my greatest leader, my mom, and think about how she was able to lead and support and help me to grow being a single mom. And so that's leadership. But more importantly, you affect leadership every day you look in the mirror, because you at some point have to make a decision as to who you want to be, how you want to show up in the world, and how you're going to navigate the world as it is. That is leadership. If we take a step out and
Mhm.
we start to zoom out a little bit, you affect leadership in your friendship circle, in your community, in your organizations, and as a global citizen. So there are many ways in which we affect leadership every day. We may not think about it, but this is an
Mm.
opportunity for us to reframe that, particularly at a time when leadership, I think, in many ways, has been lacking. Whether we're looking at our elected officials, whether we're looking at what's happening in social media, social discourse, or just what's happening in the world. I think a lot of people are looking for more inspired and real,
Mm.
relatable examples of leadership, and they don't have to
Mm.
be people or institutions that feel far removed. Oftentimes, they are right around us, and they are certainly, again, in the mirror. So that's my goal and my charge, is to help people see leadership not as this exclusive domain, but as something that all of us possess in some form or fashion.
Mm, I love that, and I love the phrase decolonizing leadership. I think hopefully you have a whole content around that because I think it's just a really interesting phrase and approach. I love it, and I think that you're right. I mean, we all have it in us, and I do think that there's, to some degree, an element of knowing what it's like to be the other and knowing what it's like to be excluded and not having full access that gives us sort of these extra superpowers, right? And I think that there's something that's really beautiful in that once we work through whatever trauma we might have.
I would agree. And, there are going to be people listening to your podcast who are going to think, oh, this is only for people who are LGBTQ or people of color
Mhm.
or women. I can't tell you how many cisgender, heterosexual white men I've spoken to who also say the leadership models don't work for me, but I'm told that I have to subscribe or ascribe to these models because of who I am. The reality is that the leadership models are just not working, not only because our current generation and the demographics are changing, but based on what we see in the world, we can tell they're not working. So it's an opportunity for us to free ourselves and look at different ways that are more relational, they're more collaborative, that involve more partnership, and are more heartful. And that's one of my
Mm,
favorite words. And that's how I try to show up in the world, is to be heartful, which means showing grace and compassion and balancing that with
mm,
innovation and creativity, and also with that can do attitude of actually getting work done and thinking and working in a collaborative, strategic, and adaptive way.
mm. I love it. Heartful. Awesome. Well, thank you, Joel. I really appreciate this conversation. I could talk about it all day, but let's get into this week's good vibes.
Yes.
The first story this week comes from PBS Kids, which is enhancing accessibility by adding American Sign Language interpreters to their popular shows. So, this is for kids who are age 2 to 8 and might not know how to read closed captions yet. So, the ASL becomes really critical in their learning and development. So right now there are six shows that have ASL versions online and they are expanding that out. I love this.
I love it too. And the reason why I think this is important is because oftentimes when we think about inclusion and equity, we think that we have to do something um, grandiose or extravagant. And what I say to organizations and leaders oftentimes is that sometimes it's the very simple and the commonsensical thing that can make and create the biggest change. So you don't have to, for example, be a revolutionary. You don't have to be marching on the streets, but it's the simple things that make people feel seen and heard and respected and give people access. And so this is something that I would imagine doesn't cost a whole lot, doesn't require a whole much of thought and strategy, but it just makes good, what I would say, human sense, to make sure that kids are able to participate and feel seen. And for those who have some type of disability where they can't hear or they can't read, to be able to just to access information and to get learning presented to them in a different way, because that's what learning is about, is making sure as many people as can have access to knowledge. So to me, this is low hanging fruit, and I hope more organizations realize that sometimes when you're trying to shoot for the moon, the solutions are right there in front of you, and you can make a real impact by doing simple things.
Yeah, I agree. And I would imagine that there needs to be some kind of level of a, let's just say if I get this right, a heartful culture in
Yes.
order to achieve this.
Yeah. Yeah. I would, yeah, it's, and recognizing, and as often, as long as I've been doing this work, helping people to know that everybody has different experiences. Sometimes the reason why these things are not readily done because people simply don't know their different realities. And so you
Right.
can look at an audience, you can look at your market share, you can look at your organization and just assume that everybody has the same experience as you. And that's just not reality. So somewhere within this organization, I'm glad that someone was able to bring the awareness. Someone was able to empathize. Someone decided to use some grace and compassion. And then there was the intention to take all that goodwill and to put it into concrete, tangible results that could actually help people, young people who I'm, of course, particularly fond of. I don't know anybody who isn't. So this is how we can actually take good feeling and good intent and actually put it into action. Because when I meet people and I talk to organizations, there's very few people I think who are not good people, but we got to understand how to marry good intentions with tangible action. So this is a concrete example of that.
Well, thank you for taking us through kind of like a little mini case study.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. The second story this week comes from Delta Airlines, which is giving a 5% pay raise to its over 80,000 ground employees and flight attendants, which is a 20 to 25% cumulative increase in compensation in just the past 2 years. This is notable because Delta also has a profit sharing payment plan to their employees. So they gave out 1.4 billion last year. So it's pretty significant that Delta is taking care of their employees in this way.
It's the idea that if you take care of your employees, they'll take care of you.
Yeah.
One of the things that I often say to leaders is the way in which you lead reflects your view of humanity. If you believe that human beings are good, and if you think that human beings inherently want to help and can help each other, then it will influence your leadership model. And I think Delta understands this. If we invest in our people, we can trust and know that they're going to put their energy, time, and investment back into the company, which will then pay off dividends or pay dividends for the rest of us. So what they're basically saying to me by this measure is that we believe in our people. We trust our people. We
Mhm.
know our people are good. They work hard and they deserve this money. So this isn't a gift. This isn't necessarily them just being charitable. They recognize that for the work that, for the investment and the commitment that their people are making, they also need to make a reciprocal investment in them. And it has a double effect for everybody. So I'm glad to see that Delta sees its employees not just as employees, but as partners and collaborators, because that's
Mm.
exactly what this type of measure reflects to me.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. I mean, we don't see other airlines doing profit sharing. I
No.
mean, we just don't. I mean, so it's definitely unique. Okay, the third story this week comes from Korea with a very unusual story. Kakao Games distinguished itself by abandoning its long-standing tradition of using English names for their Korean employees, opting instead to embrace their Korean identities. So this is very unusual in Korean workplaces.
Mhm.
And I sent a message to my friend Jane, who's Korean, and she couldn't believe it. So I think it's really great. I mean, these are the types of this is why five things is always a little bit interesting, Joel, because you just never know what you're going to get. So
Yeah, and I'm going to try to go a little bit on the deep end and then
yeah,
come back to what I hope is a simple or at least clear proposition or idea. Sometimes the most insidious part of bias is that internally we start to see ourselves as unworthy.
yeah,
I find it noteworthy that you have any company that would use cultural names, references, associations that are not native to that particular region of the world. And that's it's not limited to just Korea or Korean companies. I want to make it
yeah,
very want to be very clear about that. Sometimes we may say it's preferable to use the English name. It's preferable to use the Western European or the American name because we idealize that based on the system in which we are or the biases that we've learned or we've grown up with. But it goes back to this old thing. People are going to be more invested if they see parts of themselves. And I think it's a wonderful message to Korean youth to say your name, your culture, your background has value. That's not to say that there's not value for English names or American or British sounding names, but you also have value too. And as a Korean company, it's important to recognize that. It's important not to adopt a colonial or imperial mindset. So I think it's wonderful. I'm not a big video game head, but if I were, I'd probably pick it up, and I probably will look into this anyway because I just think this is really a wonderful trend that I hope continues with a lot of other businesses too.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Um, all right, well, let's move into the fourth story this week, which comes from LA County, where in July of 2025, retail and grocery workers are going to have more control over their schedules because a new ordinance is mandating that employers provide schedules 2 weeks in advance, offer compensation for last minute changes, and space out shifts by 10 hours. So this will affect around 200 businesses and 6,000 workers, many of whom are people of color, people with
Mm.
low income. So this really matters to them.
It's about treating people humanely.
Yeah.
I will never forget there was a congressperson, I forget their name, but I remember there was an interview and she said, work shouldn't doesn't necessarily have to be pleasant. And I thought that was one of the most um, unfortunate statements I've ever heard for someone to say, well, work doesn't have to be pleasant. Work doesn't have to, you don't have to be treated well. You don't have to make friends. Work is work. If you're spending 10 hours a day, or let's say 8 hours a day, that's a long time not to be treated with dignity,
Yeah,
courtesy, and respect. And so, although I wish that the businesses had already had this mindset, I'm
right.
glad that LA County had the foresight and the insight to say, we want to make sure that our people are given simple courtesy, that they're able to control their schedules, they're not being asked to work like robots
Yeah,
or indentured servants, and that we give them the courtesy to have control over their lives. We understand that there is a life work balance. Notice I said life work, not work life. They have families, they have lives, they have communities. We want to be sensitive to that. And we want to make sure we compensate people if their schedules prove to be difficult. I think, again, that just makes human sense. And the best way to promote business is to treat people in a humane way because your organizations consist of people. That's the thing that I think most people should recognize. You should be people centered first.
absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Beautifully said.
Thank you.
And let's this is kind of a theme today. People centered. Dell's employee resource group, so their ERGs, they have a 52% participation rate across their 120,000 global employees. So that is a lot of people that they're engaging in this. And it's because CEO Michael Dell has mandated that each of his direct reports sponsor an ERG. So it has leadership buy in from the very top and it's impacting their employees. And I just love this because we don't see a lot of companies at that level really requiring that type of buy in.
I think it comes from, and of course, I don't know Michael Dell, but if I were to have him on a call or he was sitting next to me right now, I would suspect he would say he recognizes that ERGs, employee resource groups, affinity groups, associate resource groups, have business. They are business drivers. They
Mhm.
have serious impact. They're not just social groups. They're not just leisure groups where people get together because they share something in common. They help, in many instances, they are the determining factor whether someone stays in an organization or leaves
Mhm.
an organization. It's where people can find community, it's where people can exhibit professional development, it's where people can leverage their expertise, their cultural expertise, which is, again,
Right.
the basis of my book, to help the business to be more successful. And so, for a lot of the ER, hello, hello, hello.
There you go. Hello. Lost you there for a second, Joel.
Hey, Bernadette, can you?
I can hear you. It's okay, folks. Um, this week's call to action. Join my next DEI double feature, The Belonging Buzzword. I'm hosting it with Michelle Silverthorne on May 8th, right on LinkedIn Live, and I'm going to post that in the show notes. The Belonging Buzzword, a great conversation with Michelle Silverthorne. Folks, if you don't already get the 5 Things newsletter, you can subscribe at 5thingsdei.com. Joel, thank you so much for joining me today. Joel, thank you
Sorry
so
about
much.
that. I don't know what happened.
It's okay. Don't worry about it. Joel, how can folks get in touch with you?
You can get in touch with me on Instagram at Joel A. Brown. You can find me on LinkedIn at Joel Davis Brown. You can go to my public speaker website, joeldavisbrown.com, or to our consultant website, which is Pneumos, Pneumos.com. So reach out, stay in contact, let's build a relationship, and let's dialogue. So there you have it.
All right. We'll make sure all of that gets in the show notes. Thank you so much, Joel. Always great to see you. Congratulations on the book relaunch and have a great week.
All right, you too. Thank you.
Thanks.